name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. There was a Will Smith movie a number of years ago called I, Robot. And in that movie, Will Smith plays the character he plays in every movie he's in. He basically plays Will Smith. And in this movie, like in every Will Smith movie, Will Smith gets into this terrific argument with another character, who in this movie happened to be a scientist, a really brainy scientist. So the argument is getting really heated, and Will Smith is getting really frustrated, and finally at the end of the argument, Will Smith blurts out at the scientist, "You know, you are the dumbest smart person I've ever met." Okay, Will Smith's attitude towards that scientist is a lot like the Old Testament attitude toward King Solomon. King Solomon in the Old Testament is represented as the smartest dumb person who ever lived, in the sense that Solomon was uniquely, exceptionally smart. He is represented as being the smartest guy who ever lived on one hand, and on the other hand, he's represented as being dumb, in a sense that all of us are from time to time really dumb. And in the end, the dumb things he did completely wrecked all the smart things he did. The thing is that the Old Testament isn't really working with the categories of smart and dumb. The categories the Old Testament works with is wise and foolish, which is a little bit different. So wisdom in the Old Testament comprehends this wide field of meaning, including being smart or being clever. But when the Old Testament talks about foolishness, it's not talking about being dumb. When the Old Testament writers, like Solomon, talk about a fool, they're not talking about a person who is dumb or stupid or witless or blundering. They're talking about someone who defies God and chooses instead to have things their own way. And when we do that, when we defy God and choose instead to have things our own way, we usually don't do that witlessly or blunderingly. We usually do that quite cleverly, cunningly, ingeniously, using all the brains God gave us, or misusing the brains God gave us, don't we? The Old Testament lesson this morning begins with the story of young King Solomon asking God to make him wise, which was a wise thing to ask for. It takes a certain amount of wisdom, doesn't it, to ask for wisdom? So right off the bat, Solomon is showing himself a wise young man. And right off the bat, Solomon is already behaving like a fool. When the story begins, Solomon has just been to one of the so-called high places to offer a sacrifice. Now, the high places then were the high hills in Israel where the ancient Canaanites had built altars for their idols. Okay, by the time this story takes place, Solomon's father David had long since driven all the Canaanites out of the land, but their ancient altars survived because God knew how powerfully attractive idolatry was for his people. He forbade his people from offering sacrifices in the high places. Nevertheless, Solomon offered sacrifice in the high places. And by that point, Solomon had already made his first marriage to one of the princesses of Egypt. And that, too, was forbidden by God. For the same reason that God told the people not to offer sacrifice in the high places, he told his people not to intermarry with outsiders. Okay? Not for any reason that had anything to do with anybody's color or race or ethnicity. It had nothing to do with the purity of a people's blood. It had only to do with the purity of a people's faith. Because all the nations that surrounded Israel worshipped idols. And God wanted to shelter his people from that influence so that in the fullness of time, his people could have an influence on the people around them. He wanted his people to be a light to the nations. He wanted his people to give a witness to the nations that there is but one true God who loves all the nations. It wasn't just for the sake of Israel that God wanted to shelter Israel from idolatry. It was for the sake of all the idol worshippers. It was for the sake of the Egyptians that God told his people not to intermarry with Egyptians. Nevertheless, Solomon married an Egyptian. Nevertheless, God loved Solomon. He went to visit Solomon. And when that smart, dumb person asked God to give him wisdom, God gave it to him. So, what was the wisdom that God gave Solomon? Okay, there's a really good story about that, and I bet you've heard it told before. There's two prostitutes in a brothel, and each woman gives birth to a healthy baby boy, and then one terrible night, one of the women accidentally suffocates her child. And driven mad by grief and guilt, she takes the body of her baby and she lays it in the arms of the other woman as she slept. And then she takes the other woman's baby for her own. Well, you can imagine the scene the next morning when the two women wake to nurse their babies. There is a shriek. And then there's sobbing. And then when the true mother discovers the truth, all hell breaks loose. And the two women, who are probably dragged away by neighbors who are trying to prevent a murder, are brought before King Solomon. And each woman tells the king that the child is really hers. And the king, for all his wisdom, can't tell which woman is telling the truth. So he tells one of his guards to take the baby and to take a sword and to cut the baby in half, and to give each woman 1/2 of the baby's carcass. And just as Solomon foresaw, one of the women applauded his decision, but the other woman immediately renounced all claims to the baby. And when Solomon saw the second woman renounce all claims to the child, instead of seeing the child come to harm, he knew that she must be the true mother. And so he restored the baby to her arms. That's pretty smart. That's at least clever. It's practically ingenious. That's the wisdom Solomon asked for. That's the wisdom that God gave him. The wisdom that solves dilemmas. The wisdom that solves puzzles. The wisdom that settles arguments. The wisdom that understands how people think and understands the way the world works. Okay? Actually, 2,000 years before the Italian Renaissance, Solomon was a Renaissance man. He was actually a primitive scientist. He studied the natural world, and he studied philosophy and literature and economics and politics. From his father David, Solomon inherited a kingdom carved out by war, and he enlarged it and enriched it by waging diplomacy. He made treaties with his father's ancient enemies. He made trade partners of his father's ancient enemies. And that complex set of shrewd alliances with the people around his own people brought not just Solomon, but all his people, all kinds of wealth and power and worldwide influence. Solomon, in his own day, was a wonder of the world. He was widely recognized as the wisest man in the world. He taught circles around the whole rest of the world. And in the end, he outsmarted himself. Okay, we all know that politics makes strange bedfellows. In Solomon's case, it made for numerous bedfellows. In the ancient world, when a king made a treaty with one of his neighbors, it was customary to seal the treaty by marrying your neighbor's daughter. Okay, by the end of his diplomatic career, Solomon had accumulated 700 wives. That's a lot of bedfellows. That's a lot of politics. But it wasn't just politics. The Old Testament says Solomon loved his wives, every one of them. And because he loved his wives, he built altars for his wives. Because his wives came from foreign lands and they worshipped foreign gods. And because he loved his wives, he worshipped with his wives at their altars. Okay, maybe he was just being diplomatic. Maybe he was just being shrewd. Maybe he was just being cynical. Maybe he never believed in any of his wives' gods. But whether or not he ever believed in any of his wives' gods, Solomon eventually forgot the God of his fathers, which was foolish. Using the God-given gift out of relationship with the giver, the gift lost its integrity. And then Solomon lost his integrity. And then his people, following their king, lost their integrity. And the great kingdom fell. It broke in half, and then each half of the divided kingdom was quickly overrun, divided, and conquered by its ancient enemies. There are some enemies with whom it is foolish to make a treaty. And no treaty made without integrity can possibly last. The great wisdom of Solomon had power to build a great kingdom. It was powerful enough to destroy a great kingdom. It just wasn't powerful enough to save the kingdom. It wasn't even powerful enough to save King Solomon from his own foolishness. The great wisdom of Solomon wasn't even powerful enough to save the life of a prostitute's baby. Solomon, in all his wisdom, could do no better than just hang a sword over that baby's head. The baby's life was saved that day only because there was somebody in Solomon's court wiser than he. The wisdom that saved that baby's life belonged to his mother. Seeing the sword hung over her baby's head, she saw that there was only one thing in the world that was going to save her baby's life: her renouncing all claims to her own child. And so she did it. She renounced her claims to her own child, and her child was saved. Okay, I know that doesn't look like wisdom. That just looks like the desperate act of a desperate mother who was willing to do anything or renounce anything to save the life of her child. But the desperate act of that woman is the very picture of the wisdom of God. So that his children could be saved, he surrendered his only begotten Son into the hands of his enemies. The Father renounced all claims to the life of his own Son. The Son freely renounced all claims to his own life so that we could be saved. The wisdom of God, St. Paul says, is Christ crucified. The wisdom of God, St. Paul goes on to say, looks like foolishness to the world. And when the world calls the cross foolish, the world isn't being dumb. That is the kind of wisdom that is not likely to make anybody rich or anybody powerful or anybody popular. It just happens to be the only kind of wisdom that saves. It is the wisdom that saves us from ourselves. It's the wisdom that would save us from saving ourselves by exercising our own wisdom. Okay, you will sometimes hear alcoholics in recovery say something like this: I can't think my way out of trouble because it was my own best thinking that got me into all of this trouble. If I'm ever going to get out of this trouble, I'm going to have to learn to rely on somebody else's wisdom. Okay, the problem that most alcoholics face is the problem that most Christians face. Okay, we're all trying to hold together a divided kingdom by using the brains God gave us and by using all our wits to hold it all together. Usually by making truces with our ancient enemies. Okay, whether our enemy is drinking or drugging or porn or shopping, the world, the flesh, and the devil. Our ancient enemies are always willing to negotiate with us. They are always willing to compromise with us, as long as we are willing to compromise with them. They are perfectly happy to promise us everything our own way. They're happy to see us carve ourselves up and divide ourselves and divide our loyalties and to carve other people up so that we can have things our own way. And at the end of the day, we never get things our own way. At the end of the day, our enemies take everything away from us. At the end of the day, it's just stupid. The wisdom of God is Christ crucified. And the minute we let our own wisdom become divided from that, our own wisdom is going to lose us everything we're trying to say. The wisdom of God is Christ crucified. The wisdom of God is like a desperate mother whose loyalties will not be divided and who is willing to do anything or renounce anything for the sake of love. The promise is that if we will be like her, if we will be like Christ, if we will love like God, then every good thing we renounce will be restored to our honor.